Hi there. My name is Stan Holt. I'm a consultant with Partners for Impact. We're a small consulting firm in the Raleigh-Durham area. And I am here tonight with my colleague Charlene Reese and two of my students from the PA 546 class. And this is kind of the third video in a series that Charlene and I have done that focuses on equity in program design and evaluation. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlene. And Charlene, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Charlene Reese. I am a nonprofit consultant in Durham, North Carolina, and I work with Stan at Partners for Impact. And both Stan and I actually, we met in the doctoral program at NC State, where Stan is now teaching and where this class is being held.
Great. So I'm going to jump in and start a little bit talking about the other two videos, just a summary of what we've talked about. And we've talked a lot initially about the concept of the logic model and how the logic model in and of itself is a tool that's used in program design and program evaluation. And that as you weave equity throughout that logic model, that there's this process that it's a constant process. It's an iterative process. And we've really touched on how that equity plays a role in almost every aspect of the logic model, from the inputs to the activities, to the outputs, to the various layers of outcomes. And we talked a little bit about, particularly in the second video, the importance of how an equity, especially as it relates to race, impact program evaluation. We talked a little bit about disaggregating data, making sure that we're really seeing in program evaluation and data the differences about the impact of an intervention has on different people. And we spent a little time talking about the definition of equity. And so that kind of summarizes the other two videos that we've done. And so we're going to jump in, and Charlene, you want to take the next slide and talk a little bit about our definitions?
So one of the important things to do is to really make sure that we differentiate the equality, diversity, and inclusion from equity. So equity is about the fair treatment and fair access to opportunities and outcomes across groups, across race, across gender, class, other dynamics. I mean, it's really about the distribution of power and access to opportunity. So it's not just diversity of there's different people at the table, or inclusion, there's different people at the table. Diversity, they look different, those people look different, but that all those voices are heard, and that the power is shared. And that starts with who decides who is at the table, and what the agenda is, what's being talked about. So when we talk about equity, we talk about racial equity, and we are explicit about race because of our history of systemic racism. Racial equity underlies all equity in our country and in our culture. And so there are other inequities that we look at and that are important. And if you follow the thread back, almost always they go back to race and racial inequity. And so that's why we are very explicit, always explicit about race when we're talking about equity.
Yeah, you know, Charlene, I was thinking about the project about the whole who's at the table and who decides who's at the table. And I was thinking about the conversation that we had a couple of days ago in preparation for the meeting yesterday with one of our clients about, you know, we have to be very mindful about who is, you know, when you're starting a project, you have to be mindful of who is at the table and who has the power. I mean, there's power in inviting people to the table, right? So there's got to be a very deliberate element of when bringing people to the table, that those who are inviting step away from the table, that it becomes a different power dynamic when we're in those situations. And I just want to reiterate something, you know, diversity is about the number, inclusion is about making sure that there are diverse people at the table. Equality is about that notion of the sameness, right? And recognizing that the same is not the same as equity, right? We don't have the same power, right? And I think that's the important part here. Anything else on that slide that we need to kind of think about, Charlene?
I think we're good.
Yeah, okay.
You want me to?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so when we talk about using a racial equity lens in evaluation, we are talking about looking at all of the systems and experiences that make up a person's story. So looking at not just that individual client, that individual family, that individual child in the program, but really what are all the systems that surround those people and the organization that they're interfacing with. And so what we have to recognize is that people's lives are impacted differently by systems. My life, I'm impacted differently by a system than Stan is. And we're both we would both be impacted differently by systems than, you know, the students here would be. And the systems, because of the way they were built, systems privilege some people over others. And it means that people have different choices when they're in those systems. Not everybody has the same choices when they are working through systems, when they're interfacing with systems. And when we're talking about systems, we can, you know, you can think about a few like the public school system or the education system or the financial system, you know, banking, or the social welfare system, you know, social services or healthcare. Those are all systems. And if you think about how people go through them, every person has a different experience and have different choices that are available to them in those systems, and they navigate the systems differently. And so when we are evaluating a program, we have to really look at how does the system affect people's choices. That people, not everybody, you know, you put 10 people through a system and you just think, okay, it's all of how they come out the other side of the system is all about what their own decisions, and everything's equal. It is not equal because the system treats everybody differently.
Yeah, and so the story is this poverty simulation, and this to me was one of the situations in a previous job. I used to facilitate poverty simulations, and in a poverty simulation, participants would come in and they would take on the role of a family that's living in poverty, and those families would look different, but around the room would be the services, but they would be like the banking service, the grocery store. We had a pawn shop. We had a church. We had a nonprofit. We had a Department of Social Services. And the goal was for people to like come out on the other side of a 4-week simulation, which was basically 4 15-minute weeks, to be able to pay their rent, pay their utilities, and you know, live basically. And time again, particularly people in poverty, you would see the light bulbs go on as people saw They were doing everything they can that they thought was right and that the system would allow them to do, and they still couldn't make their rent, right? They still couldn't pay their utility bill. Because that's why we think about, for us, particularly in evaluation and program design, we really want to think about not only the individual, but the system around the individual, because that is the thing that exerts the pressure that can advantage or disadvantage a group of people. So these are kind of questions that we are over and over beginning to think about as we bring an equity lens to program design and evaluation. And the first one is, our interventions designed for those made most vulnerable by systemic racism, most often people of color, right? So I think that this is about that notion of, are we designing for those that are at the margins? Because what we know is that if we are designing interventions so that we can work and solve the problems associated with those folks that are experiencing at the margins, we're actually going to impact not only those individuals and families' lives, but everybody's life, right? It's going to improve every situation.
And the converse is not true.
Right. The converse
If you design for the people in the center, the people that have the most advantage, the people with the fewest needs, you will not, most likely you will not be designing an a program or an intervention that serves everybody. Whereas if you are, as Stan said, if you're designing for those with the highest needs, then you are most likely going to be meeting those with the needs of those with the most advantage.
Right, go ahead and go to the second one if you want.
Okay, so then, so as we start to think about these interventions and equity, it's really important to go back and think about who designed the intervention. And it's kind of like what you learn in research is that the research question will determine what the answers are, or what data are looked for, or how a question is answered. And you can change outcomes by asking a different question, or you can change conclusions by asking a different question. And it's the same with interventions. Who is designing the intervention, and what are their experiences? What do they know? And then is the intervention, are they valuing lived experience, for example, and empower, so are they empowering people to design the solutions that they need for themselves? Or is it, so that's kind of, are they valuing the expertise of lived experience, or are they only valuing the expertise of the experts, the people with the degrees? Not to diss the people with the degrees, of course, but it's a different kind of experience, and it's a different kind of expertise.
Expertise and almost wisdom, right? There's a different kind of wisdom in lived experience that doesn't exist in other situations. And I think that leads to the third question that, as we're thinking about interventions, as we're thinking about, okay, what works for people, and, the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial, and that you have these best practices, and that you have this evidence base. Well, if we've got to constantly, if we're using an equity lens, ask ourselves, well, who says it's a best practice, right? Who says this is the best evidence to make that judgment? Because if we begin to question who says this is a best practice, right, it can open the door to really, okay, is this a practice based on lived experience, right? Or is this a practice that is based on the experience of those who are advantaged versus those who are disadvantaged by the system, right? If the practices are for those that are advantaged by the system, we've excluded those who are disadvantaged by the system. So again, who says these are best practices is also really important when we think about this concept of equity.
I'll just say, yeah, I mean, that's really, I mean, in all things, when you're looking at evidence-based or best practices, it's important to go, if you can, and look at who were they testing these best practices on? Who were they collecting the evidence from? Because what you may find is that the evidence that they've collected is from a group of people, you know, a group of subjects that don't look anything like the group of subjects, you know, the population that you're trying to serve, right? And so, you know, if you're trying to serve folks who live in an urban environment, high density, you know, plenty of access to public transportation, and that's where the best practices come from. But you know, that's where the best practices come from. But you are serving a rural community, you know, with no public transportation and no density. You know, that best practice, yeah, it's best practice. It's evidence-based, but is it going to apply to what you're doing? Right. So that's just one example.
Right. So you constantly have to who says and who says about who.
Right.
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 So,
where did that evidence come from?
Yeah. And we've got more things that we're really paying attention to too, right? That intervention should not be designed around individual failing, but we have to consider the system around them, right? That's kind of what I was talking about with the poverty simulation. When we design an intervention, say around homeless families, right? We need to understand the system that's at play in addition to what the individual families are experiencing. And that the second bullet there is the next extension of that, and that is that by not looking at the system, we inevitably hold the individual and the household completely responsible for change, right? And that therein lies some of the inequity that we see when we start thinking about these issues. Charlene, you want to keep going on that conversation?
Sure. So, So what one of our colleagues says is intervention shouldn't be about fixing families, you know, or fixing children. We really need to look at the system and fix the system that is holding these families in this situation that they are now needing services. And we talk a lot, I mean, our world is really human services, and that's really where we come from. So when we do an evaluation and we're looking at how equity plays in, we want to look at all the different layers of what's happening. So what's happening at the program level, what's happening at the organization level, and what's happening at the systems level. And the interventions, that's how interventions should be designed. Like, how do you create change at the program level, at the organization level, and the systems level? Why don't you talk about the last one, Stan?
Yeah, I was looking at the last one and then I'm like, I'm not sure I remember us talking about that, but
I was hoping you were the one that wrote it.
Yeah, I know, right? So what I was thinking was that, you know, Charlene, I just am not sure.
Actually, I do know, that part of defining the outcomes of the program, if you're really valuing lived experience and you really are centering the people you're serving, that then they should be the ones who define and identify what the outcome, the outcome that you want should be, right? And they should be defining how that outcome is measured. So an example would be, one of my worlds is in domestic violence, for example, or and sexual assault. And so what we know is that sometimes the system prioritizes putting somebody in prison. And that's the outcome that is measured, is trials and time spent in prison. But what we know from research working with the victims of violence is that putting somebody in prison is not always the most valuable outcome for them. Sometimes it is being heard. Sometimes it's actually getting an apology from the person that you know, and an acknowledgement of the harm, or it's just getting to safety and having that person out of their lives, but not necessarily in prison. And so that's a pretty extreme example, but it is one that's very stark. And in the work that I do, we talk a lot about how you have to listen to the people you're serving, to hear from them what outcome to them is most important and how it should be measured.
Yeah, that's really good example, Charlene. That's a really powerful example. So this kind of gets to the fact that, you know, traditionally in evaluation, and we start thinking in human services, we want to create strengths-based programs. So we do needs assessments. We find out what individuals' strengths are. We find out what their challenges are. And when we do that, when we go that route, what we end up doing is limiting our way of thinking in such a way that we focus on the individual and not the system, right? So if I'm a frontline case manager and I'm asking a client, what's the situation? What are your needs? What are we good at? What are the goals that you want to have? Again, that system is that case manager has already shifted into that fixing the family, right? It's shifted into that mode of where the system is kind of ignored. It's just missed, right? And you don't then change the system, right? If you don't approach it at a different, from a different perspective. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we wanted to say about that one. I think that's it.
We've covered it all.
Yeah. And I think this is just what I also said. To create a more equitable society, we need to change the system that's causing the inequities, right? So we need to change the structures, organizations, and people that are within those systems. And as opposed to changing the people affected by the system, right?
Yeah. I was just gonna go on that one. One of my most favorite quotes came from a conference, a North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault conference. And one of the speakers said, it's not enough to heal the harm that's done to victims if you are not also working to disrupt the system that allowed the harm to happen. And that's really where we're working, disrupting that system that allowed the harm. Right. Or that put put people in those situations.
So before we got into the presentation, we were talking a little bit before class about the use of theory in practice. And so this is the example where both Charlene and I at some point in our lives have been introduced to this socio-ecological model, right? it comes out of human behavior. And I think I learned it mostly around public health behavior stuff. And you have that individual knowledge, attitude, skills in the center, and that all these layers change to change that individual in the middle, right? You need the social network to change. You need the environment to change. You need the cultural context and the community to change, and you need public policy. All those so that the individual can change. And so,
and to create community change, like to create a change in the community.
Well, this is how we've adapted it. We've adapted it to say, you need to create community change. And so here's how we've kind of played with it, right?
Right.
So talk about it. You were ready to roll.
Sorry, I was ready to roll. Yeah, I was thinking about differently, right? So the way that we've adapted it is that, and the way that this really, we use this in our evaluation work, is we really think about 4 levels: the individual, the organization, the system, and the community. And when we say individual, we're not talking about the person receiving the services. We're actually talking about the person providing the services. And we look at how are each of these pieces operating to bring about community change, which is usually what the organization is trying to achieve, is some sort of community change. But it really needs to be looked at and teased out at these different levels. I think that we have slides for each of them, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
As we were saying, so the context of a community change initiative, we're really saying that the staff and the people providing the intervention are the ones at the center, and we're measuring, we're evaluating what's happening around them. How are their knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors changing as they serve people, not looking at the target group as the individual.
Right. So a great example is a project that Charlene and I are working on that is it's a parent intervention, right? It's a parent intervention for making sure that children are safe and connected to their caregiver. And it, again, if we solely look at a parenting intervention as targeting the parents, we are like saying we're going to fix them. But if you start looking at the teachers and facilitators and home visitors who work with the parents, if you start working with those individuals, therein lies where, if you start changing those folks' knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes, you have a whole different way of really looking at how your system is impacting your families.
Right. And when you think about it, well, I should say this. In the way that we do evaluation with organizations, we recognize that often what the organization can do is affect what the provider does. And so the intervention, or what's happening is around the provider. So we are looking at, okay, how does what the organization is doing around the provider, how is that changing the knowledge, attitudes, and behavior of the provider? Because that's where they have targeted, where they are have influence, as opposed to again trying to measure the change at the family level, which the family is affected by so many other systems. I may not have actually clarified anything, but it made sense in my head.
Yeah. No, that's good. And this is just, I think we're ahead of ourselves, but I think, right. So the individual at the center is not the client, the program participant, or the family. in our adapted model, it's the provider, and it's, I have to move my picture. Individual in the adapted model is the provider working with the individual at the very center. And we're constantly asking in the center and or the rest of the system, who is burdened by the system and who is advantaged by the system, right? So that's another layer when we're looking at the individuals, at the even the providers, asking who is burdened by the system and who is advantaged by the system. There seems like there needs to be something else said to that, Charlene.
I think we can come back. I mean, there's multiple other layers here.
Yeah, you know, so I'm going to tell my example. I'm going to skip to one of the end slides because I think this is really a good example, and it's where my head is right now. And, you know, working with folks that are working with young people who are homeless and runaway, right? So there's an organization that we're working with and I'm helping them put a grant together. And so the client is the homeless or runaway youth. But the individual staff people and the organization has made a huge commitment to making sure that they're using positive youth development as a strategy, which is all about letting the young person guide, right? So the organization is training their staff. They are changing their policies. They are taking an approach that's about positive youth development so that young people have the ability to create self-determination for their life, right? The other thing they're doing is trying to bring in and create trauma-informed services. So again, the policies and procedures of the staff and the organization investing in the staff will make a difference to the frontline staff who then are interacting with the young people. So I think that that's really, when we start putting the practical example, this is where you start seeing how that system can play, right? And I'm just gonna keep going, right? So then the system is, so what are the other youth serving organizations in the community? Who funds the organization? And what kind of pressure and or mandate does the funding community put on the organization? And one of the huge elements in the system in Wake County, where we're located, was that North Carolina had we were the last state in the country where those young people between the ages of 16 and 18 were tried in adult criminal court, right? And so the policy change for raising the age that occurred last year has made a huge difference in those young people who interact with the justice system, right? Huge systems change element that plays from the systems change to the organization, to the frontline caseworkers, street outreach workers, that impacts that individual, right? So that's how we have played with this socio-ecological model in such a way that these are all elements that we have to look at, we have to evaluate in order to really see the community change, which is what we want, which is young people growing and developing and being healthy adults. So I kind of had to just do that example, Charlene. And I think you're up next pretty soon about your example. And I think we should do that.
Okay, yeah, but we'll talk about the community level first. So so we talk about that the individual in our model are the service providers. So then the question is, where are the people receiving services? And for us, we see that as the community. That's the target population for the work, for the intervention. And we really came to this as we realized that change in individuals can be very slow, and there's many factors, and it's hard to measure. And it it is an outcome of all these other layers, right? And so we put that change of the community level, that's where the individual recipients of services or target population is. And this, Sissy shows up in every video. So, and the real positive change, you know, if you have positive change at the individual provider level, at the organization level, and the systems level, then you will be getting your positive outcomes at the community level with your target population. I was thinking about, you know, kind of putting this in a data and analysis framework that we were talking a little bit about. You know, when you are when you're doing a multivariate analysis and you talk about holding other variables constant, you know, and that you need to be accounting for all your variables that are in a system, that's what we're doing here. And we're recognizing that there's never a one-to-one relationship, right? There's never only one variable that you're changing. There's multiple variables, and you have to be looking at all of them. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So another world in my sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking world is where I spend some of my working time, the anti-human trafficking world. And so here's an example to kind of walk through those systems. I mean, walk through that model using an example from the anti-human trafficking world and how we would evaluate the different levels. And so what question is that we had in one of the earlier slides was, is the intervention designed for those made most vulnerable by the system? And in human trafficking, those most vulnerable are young women of color, LGBTQ teens, particularly LGBTQ teens of color, and trans people of color. They are most vulnerable to trafficking. And so when we're looking at a program, when I'm thinking about the programs that I work with, I want to look at the individual level and at the staff. And I want to know, what does the staff know about these populations? How do they view them? How are they trained about them? What do they, what's their attitude and their own experience? So when they are working with these vulnerable populations. At the organizational level, I want to know what kind of outreach are they doing to these populations? What kind of policies do they have? For example, there are organizations that say, we don't work with trans people. We don't feel we have the capability of doing that, so we don't. Or there's organizations that say, oh, we will work with LGBTQ youth. Our religion says that it's an abomination, a sin, but we're happy to work with them. Okay, do you have policies around that? And is that affecting your policies and your staffing? What do your forms say? Do your forms require people to choose a gender from a binary choice, or are they open-ended? And then who are your partners? Are you working with other organizations that the population you're working with may feel like you would be putting them at risk, or they would be putting themselves at risk to come to your organization, for example, because you work out of the police station, and they don't want to come to the police station ever. Then there's the larger system of how is DSS operating, Department of Social Services operating, that create situations and vulnerabilities for people that limit their choices so they end up vulnerable to being trafficked. Education, criminal justice system, legislation, culture, funding, all of those are the system that all wrap around both the organization, how the organizations function, how the individuals in the organization function, and then again, how we have to look at how the system is holding the people who we're trying to serve, and how they, how sometimes the systems that are designed or supposedly designed to help them are actually increasing their vulnerabilities. So then what we want to look at is we want to know then what are the outcomes for those at most risk. And we want to find out from them, what are the outcomes that you're looking for, and how should we measure that? And is it working or not working? Or what is your experience? What has been your experience in these different systems? And that is how we would approach an evaluation, so that we can get the whole picture and then work to improve the different pieces.
Yeah, that goes back to your that slide that had the outcome, making sure that the folks that are with the lived experience help us define the outcomes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good. I already talked about this. It's that whole piece about homeless and runaway youth that I used as I was going through those slides. So the last slide I wanted to do is just kind of introduce you all to the concept of equitable evaluation, which is actually, there's a whole segment of evaluation. It's an equitable evaluation initiative. And these are the 3 principles that are on their website that they're really digging into, really thinking about how evaluation can impact equity. And the first one is, how is evaluation in service and contributes to equity in general, right? And then it's thinking about how evaluation work is designed and implemented in ways that are both multicultural and participant owned. Right? Remember, we talked about that notion of, do the participants help us to define the outcomes? Do they help us define how these are measured? And then the final big principle is, we talked about this at the beginning, and we've talked about this before, is how do interventions impact different populations and the underlying causes of inequity, right? So how do we look at these interventions and the strategies that we implement? How do they impact the different populations? And what's the history and cultural context of some of the changes that we are proposing? And what are the history and cultural context of the current system, right? So those are all just a kind of, I would say, just a simple introduction to equitable evaluation that you can dig in on their website and, find a little bit more about. And it feels like from where we sit, we're pretty consistent with some of these principles. We've kind of come at it in a different from a different angle, in part because of the equity consultants that we tend to partner with and work with, but we're moving in this direction. I think that's our last slide, Charlene. Do we need to say anything? And then Amy and Brad, do you have any questions that you want to ask Charlene and I before we stop the recording? Charlene, you want to start, or do you have anything to add?
I had a thought as I was reading this one earlier today of just being really clear about how we are evaluating to look at equity in an organization or in an intervention, and how equity, issues of equity in that organization. And we are making sure that we're interrogating our own process of the evaluation to make sure that that is equitable.
Right.
So I think that's kind of what this is saying, that it's not just, if you are evaluation, you're doing an evaluation and you're not looking at your own practices, then you're not really doing equitable evaluation. Even if you're doing the best interrogation of the program that you've been hired to evaluate, you're doing the best, look at their equity, but you're not looking at your own practice and you're not approaching it in an equitable way, then you're not meeting the standards of equitable evaluation. And I'm interested to hear if you all have questions or even thoughts, if anything bubbles up from what we've said.
And it's okay if you don't.
Yeah, it was a lot of information. Yeah.
So I think what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and end the recording. Or Brad, you're getting off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So just thinking about this presentation, like from start to finish, I guess a good question would be for an organization who has been engaging in evaluations, and they see this and they're like, all right, we want to make the shift. What would you recommend would be that first step in kind of transitioning from thinking about the system in a traditional way to thinking about like, we are a part of the systematic change that we're trying to implement?
Funny you should ask that, because we're living that as we speak. Do you want to talk about it, Charlene?
Well, I would say it depends on the organization, and how much of their own work they've done. So we actually, one of our videos, I don't know if we've done the video yet, but we have definitely worked on this sort of double logic model, where you recognize that your staff needs to be better trained in equity. That's where you really need to start, right? You need to start in what does your staff understand about equity? And then you want to train them up. And then as they learn more, your logic model, all those pieces are going to change as they understand how they need to change their programming and how the organization needs to change, right? So that logic model sets out what your inputs, your activities, your outputs, and your outcomes. And So what happens is that the training of your staff on racial equity becomes an input. But it also is kind of an output that then now you have more trained staff on racial equity. Now you may need to change your inputs and your activities because you realize what your organization needs to do to really be addressing racial equity. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add the very first step is common language around race, common language around equity, those simple definitions of diversity, inclusion, equity, equality, really grounding that in folks. And then particularly as you're thinking about it from a programmatic evaluation piece, the language that we use is important, right? The logic model language, the output language, the outcome language, right? So there's this whole, honestly, that's the first step, is that common language, common understanding. And then, and Charlene, you'll know where I'm coming from, we have to ask ourselves why. Why is this important, right? Why is this important for our organization? And getting to that piece as well. So those are a couple of things that when you ask that question immediately, it's common language, and then why is this important?
And I would add the third thing, once you've got that common language and you are able to be talking about it, then you begin to really interrogate, you start asking that question, who holds the power? Mm-hmm. where and who and what, and there's all kinds of power, right? There's different kinds of power. And you really have to interrogate the organization about how does power operate here? And is it advantaging some people and disadvantaging others? And that's at all the layers too, because it's not just how is the power dynamic advantaging or disadvantaging the clients that you're working with, where there's usually a power differential, but also within your organization, within your providers, within your staffing. How is power playing out? Do some people have more power because they're the extroverts, right? And they show up and talk at meetings, right? And then the introverts have less power because they get talked over, right? That's just one example. And then you can interrogate the system as well, of the system that we're operating in, who holds the power and who's disadvantaged by it.
And then the other piece is learning and knowing just the characteristics of a white supremacy culture, right? The work that was done by Dr. Tema Okun, we go back to that over and over and over again in situations where, nope, that's a white supremacist culture characteristic, right? That's the system. So how do we disrupt it? So good question.
That's a great question, yeah.
Anything else? All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. Thanks everybody for whoever is watching this. And certainly if you have questions, Charlene and I can be reached at our emails. We need to change your email there, Charlene, because it's now Charlene at Partners for Impact. So, and you can visit our website, partnersforimpact.com. We've actually got some reports based on some of the equity evaluation and equity work that we have done on the website. So please feel free to do that. So thanks again.